Americans unconditionally is a good thing, then yeah, you'll see it as a good thing. You'll see it as a positive. It always has the capacity to erode civil liberties and also greatly worsen material conditions for the working class, as we cover on a daily basis. So I would say that there is probably a better evolution beyond that. Liberal democracy, bourgeois democracy is significantly better than monarchies, of course. But I personally believe that it's time for a evolution.
Helper J. Lovestone, became known as splitters of unions who organized against communist influence in the labor movement. Brown gave money to anti-communist currents which broke strikes in Italy or France, for instance. It's really amazing how far Western powers went and still go to pacify workers and hinder them from developing revolutionary consciousness. The Menderes clique was more sympathetic toward the US, and it had a more positive stance toward conservative religious groups than the CHP, thus gaining support from sections frustrated with Kemalist secularization. With the rising influence of the US, the DP further bolstered its potential for electoral victory because it coincided with the American wishes to privatize state enterprises and a general westernization of Turkey. After the DP's rise to power, Turkey sent troops to the Korean War in 1950 to ensure membership in NATO, which had formed in 1949. Anti-communist persecution intensified and coincided with McCarthyism in the US. The state targeted not just organized Marxists, but university professors and various progressive intellectuals and journalists. American experts poured in to advise Turkey in westernizing education, teaching children the merits of self-responsibility, the evils of collectivism, reintroducing religious courses, and connect them to anti-progressive propagandizing, showing anti-communist educational movies, and so on.
I don't know if he mentions this, but Adnan Menderes, by the way, is obviously very right-wing, religious, conservative, populist, and is like his movement of religious conservative populism is basically what ultimately gave way to Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which comes from that same background and same clique, and also Fethullah Gülen. Now, Fethullah Gülen and Recep Tayyip Erdogan are two sides of the same coin. However, one is directly aligned with the CIA, and the other one happens to be the president now, previously prime minister, now president of Turkey. They're all, yeah, it shatters that hepsi tarikatçı. So tarikat is like the fundies of Turkey, if that makes sense. And Fethullah Gülen operates a cult, a religious Muslim cult, very fundamentalist, and happens to do so from the comfort of his home in the Poconos. Adnan Menderes'e laf ediyorsun ama bilmiyorsun. Yapma abi, yapma. %100 top of the hour ad break çakacaksın şimdi, değil mi? Amına koyayım senin kodlama 0. He's trying to fucking serve me a 3-minute ad break debate in Turkish. Yakalarım. Abi burada Ohio'da FETÖ okulu varmış yaşadığım yerde. Siyah Amerikalı adam Türkçe biliyor. Karşıma çıktı amına koyayım. Evet. Her yerde var ki. Amerika'da her yerde var. Afrika'da her yerde var. Amerikan parasıyla açıyorlar. CIA. Anyway. Yeah, at the top of the hour, there is a 3-minute ad break. Oğlum Adnan Öven adamın bu chatte ne işi var? Sikeceğim. Hayır. Taşak geçiyor. Debate atmaya çalışıyor şey. Ondan sonra dönüp diyecek ki 3 dakikalık advertisement break geliyor. Dedi zaten. Debate oğlu. Anyway. Dedim bile görmedin ha. Bak. Her saat başı 3 dakikalık reklam olacaktır demiş Adnan Menderes. Senin amına koyayım. Kayboldu diyorlar FETÖ burada. Orada haber olmadı değil mi? Yok, ne haber olacak burada? Americans don't know who the fuck Fethullah Gulen is. They don't care. They don't know. It's just like he's just some random dude. There are so many Fethullah Gulen types in the United States of America that like most Americans have no fucking clue. There's a Fethullah Gulen for every country that America is involved in. Like some fucking rabid fundamentalist right-wing weirdo that the CIA keeps on payroll and protects. For every country that America has an involvement in. Yeah, and his Freedom. Enes Kanter Freedom is one of his main guys. The forward-facing side of Fethullah Gulen's influence. But I'm unfamiliar with the... Wait, what? Kara Swisher AOC podcast mentioned me? Kara Swisher did a podcast with AOC and she mentioned me? Oh, let's go. Wait,
dissemination in some form.
We'll look at that in a sec. We'll look at that later. At 58:18. Okay. Anyway, let's continue. But something to consider. The reason why I brought up Menderes, I don't know how deep he will go into Adnan Menderes, but like his influence and his religious movement, religious conservative populist movement was so significant in Turkish politics now that like the leading coalition and more importantly, Recep Tayyip Erdogan himself personally and the fucking CIA asset living in the goddamn Poconos is all a part of his like cultish movement.
The Pentagon was also aware that fostering and utilizing reactionary Turkish nationalism would serve their strategic interests, as it was a potent deterrent against communist ideas. The Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, was the covert action arm of the CIA and unambiguously called in its charter for, quote, propaganda, economic warfare, preventative direct action, including sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition and evacuation measures, subversion against hostile states, and support of indigenous anti-communist elements. Indigenous anti-communist elements is, of course, a much nicer expression than fascists. By the end of 1951, Turkey had received over $400 million in military aid along with 1,200 US military advisors. Within the next 3 decades, Turkey would receive a further $5.8 billion in military support, including training programs and arms supply. Those aid packages, as usual, had hundreds of strings attached, such as Turkey allowing the Americans to restructure its military and secret service apparatus, or the commitment to buy US products. One example of that is the US forcing Turkey to focus on building automobile highways and airports as opposed to railroads, through obliging them to focus on importing automobiles and petroleum, which are of course a much bigger opportunity to make a profit. Then, naturally in 1952, Turkey officially became a member of NATO. The country was key for the Western powers, guarding a third of NATO's total borders with the communist bloc and serving as an important balcony for US operations in the Middle East. And then, as left organization, demonstrations...
This is the part that is like the most important as far as like my anger and resentment for NATO. As a Turkish person, this is where you will now develop a better understanding of what NATO does in other countries.
And the opposition to US imperialism intensified. In the shadows of the NATO membership announcement, a secret, bloody fascist network had already begun to spread its tentacles. As a result of Turkey becoming an appendage of US imperialism, and due to the rapidly rising popularity of communist and progressive ideas, it naturally became involved with the notorious Operation Gladio, a secret army intelligence complex organized by NATO and the CIA in collaboration with intelligence agencies throughout Europe to counter the communist threat. Gladio was so powerful and vast, and yet the intelligence agencies managed to largely keep it a secret for decades. It was not until the 90s when it was officially revealed by Italian politician Giulio Andreotti The revelation was a bombshell and made waves around the world. The operation was particularly brutal in Italy, Greece, and Turkey. In each of these countries, violent fascist or neo-Nazi groups were used to crush the left, such as in Italy, where progressive movements were infiltrated and where fascist terrorist attacks were blamed on the left wing to discredit it, all with the help of state security. I've made a video on Gladio in Italy, which you should check out after watching this. But it is in Turkey where the secret army was the most violent and brutal. The Turkish branch of Gladio was created in the same year when Turkey joined NATO under the codename Counter-Guerilla, and it was located in the building of the Joint American Military Mission for Aid in the Turkish capital, Ankara.
Wait, what? Why would that be there? That's so strange.
The largest of the US European commands. And who was one of its founding members? None other than the aforementioned Hitlerite Alparslan Türkeş. The Turkish National Security Service, MAH, received financial support from the CIA. Leading members of the Turkish Gladio were recruited from this agency. The CIA under Alan Dulles assigned former Nazi officers, Wehrmacht General Reinhard Gehlen, Butcher of Lyon and Che Guevara hunter Klaus Barbie, and various other fascists to train the Gladio leaders, including MAH officers in the camps from the Unconventional Warfare Department.
Wait, what?
In 1951, the Communist Party was...
Wait, what? No, wait. I thought we were fighting the World War II and the D-Day and we fought the Nazis. Wait, say it ain't so. You mean to tell me that we collaborated with some of the worst Nazis, like famous ones? Wasn't there a story that we read on the stream recently about how Mossad found Klaus Barbie and then were ordered to stand down? I'm trying to find that article now. Chad, this is what people mean when they say Germany lost the war but fascism won? Yes.
Was crushed, and all of its leaders and most members were imprisoned through the notorious mass arrests ordered.
Why do you always say America bad, Hasan? So what if they funded and collaborated with Nazis globally to support fascist movements that slaughtered political dissidents? Yeah. Just weird that I would have such an opinion.
By the Menderes government, in full coherence, of course, with its proclamations of multi-party democracy. The Turkish Gladio was already active here, but it was not until a few years later, in 1955, when it was involved in its first major operation. The Democrat Party orchestrated a secret action along with the counter-guerrilla to bomb the Turkish consulate in Thessaloniki in Greece, in the house where Atatürk was born. The so-called free press in Turkey would then spread the story suggesting that it was the Greeks who
Atamızın evi bomba ile hasara uğradı.
set off the bomb. What followed would result in thousands of Greeks fleeing their homes, in what came to be known as the Istanbul pogrom, or
Today your coverage is pretty bad, Hasan. What do you mean? Dude, I already ran the top of the hour ad break if you're doing that. Sen Selanik göçmeni miydin, öyle bir şeydi? I thought I was from Selanik. I thought my parents had told me that we're from Selanik, and then the Wikipedia page says we're from Drama, my father's side, which apparently is true. I was wrong my whole life. Not from Selanik, but from Crete and also Drama. Am I saying that right? I don't even know.
The state, along with the counter-guerrilla, carried out and supported mob attacks against Greeks, Armenian, or Jewish people, destroying their small businesses or abusing hundreds of Greek women, with the police being demonstrably present and doing nothing. And in the most ridiculous way possible, Menderes then blamed the communists, who had been themselves already crushed by the state, for carrying out those pogroms. And subsequently, 45 so-called card-carrying communists were arrested. This type of false flag action and propaganda was a core tool of the Gladio operations, not just in Turkey. The Menderes government grew increasingly unpopular. Money from the Marshall Plan ran out, and after the first severe economic crisis of Turkish capitalism in the 50s, it lost the support of both the parliament and the people. Under the pressure from the US, which saw Turkey as a breadbasket of the West, the DP had unilaterally promoted the agricultural sector with the funds of the Marshall Plan and renounced the development of heavy industry. Due to the massive foreign trade deficit amounting to 60% of total exports, urgently needed industrial goods such as machines and raw materials could no longer be imported. By borrowing from the World Bank and the IMF, Turkey continued to run up debt until it could no longer pay its foreign debts. Menderes reacted to the opposition by arresting his political rivals and critical journalists. Unfortunately, much of the indignation of the Turkish masses was channeled into organizations who
Whether they traded our parents and grandparents? Yeah, they traded our grandparents. It's
were
true.
themselves reactionary. As Kaipakaya wrote, since there was no communist leadership to show the way to the masses, the popular opposition followed this or that reactionary clique and was squandered. This is what always happens in situation of crises. Frustration and indignation get co-opted and channeled into movements that don't endanger the capitalist system, such as reformism and even fascism. Menderes was then deposed and was executed in the 1960 coup d'etat by the military officers, the first of several coups in the Republic of Turkey. The CIA-linked and US-trained Alparslan Türkeş was one of those commanders, and his clique wished to implement its fascist program. But the faction favoring a multi-party system around the coup leader, General Cemal Gürsel, who then became president, won out, and a new constitution was approved in 1961. The US wasn't too worried about this, as Gürsel quickly emphasized, Turkey remains faithful to its Western alliance. Now, former Prime Minister İsmet İnönü of the CHP was once again elected to restore freedom. Unsurprisingly, that didn't last very long.
This is where the Grey Wolves come in.
Colonel Alparslan Türkeş attempted again to take power in 1963, but his coup attempt failed and he was put in jail. Comically, he was then released shortly afterward on the basis of a supposed lack of evidence. Now he was free to greatly affect Turkish politics in the coming years. In 1965, he founded the infamous National Action Party, short MHP, and more importantly, along.
It's just so strange how this guy. Yeah, Menderes was not a freedom fighter himself. He comes from feudal roots, feudal landlord, massive landlord, wealthy family. It's just so odd that this guy just keeps coming back and is building this ultra nationalist fascist party. What an impressive story. You know, real rags the richest type shit. You know what I mean? It's just so odd how that surely the US has no involvement. Surely. I mean, what? That's crazy.
Along with it, its youth organization and fascist paramilitary wing, the notorious Bozkurtlar, known in English as the Grey Wolves. Its ideology, the superiority of the Turkish race. Quote, what is the source of this superiority? The Turkish blood. Its goal, Turan, a united Turk state from Eastern Europe to Xinjiang.
This is part of the reason why I've always made a shit ton of jokes. I hope this is a little bit more illuminating for many of you in this chat who never really quite understood why I would like have so much smoke for someone like Vosh, before the goblin porn stuff. Because you were like, what? I don't understand. Like, he's just pro-NATO and you're anti-NATO. It was additionally laughable. And you will find out exactly why in a brief moment. It is additionally laughable that that community also happened to claim, while being pro-NATO themselves, mind you, that I was anti-Kurdish. And I was a pan-Turanist, Turk supremacist, anti-Kurdish, Turkish guy. It was just odd. It was odd and weird and funny because, like, you know, I do meme a lot about the Grey Wolves and shit like that. But it's pretty funny that they're saying that, like, my anti-NATO position makes me a fascist when NATO and Turkey, much like NATO in all of these other countries like Greece and Italy, is pro-fascist.
Quote, our struggle goes to the last man, to the last breath, to the last drop of blood.
Your points are really valid, but someone who watches you both for years, I don't think you disagree here. I think it's miscommunication from fans of clips. No, that motherfucker did literally say I'm anti-Kurd. Okay? He did. And he is also pro-NATO, so get the fuck out of here.
Our struggle continues until nationalist Turkey, until Turan, is reached. The CIA and NATO-trained Turkish initiated the movement with the purpose to establish a nationalist movement that could counter the communist efforts domestically and in.
This is pretty important. The Turanist movement is very important as an anti-communist measure, both inside of Turkey and also, as Bestie Marks correctly pointed out in the beginning of the fucking video, everywhere where the USSR existed, because there was a lot of Turkic nations under the banner of the USSR at this point, and they are trying to, America by way of Turkey is trying to instill separatist movements and nationalist movements by training, supporting militia movements. They still literally exist inside of Russian boundaries to this day, as a matter of fact. And there is still some level of involvement from the Turkish government with even Xinjiang, all the way to, because it spans all the way to what would be considered East Turkestan, Xinjiang, under the Chinese nation state. Yeah. So all the way to Uyghurs, like these are all Turkic people. Remember, half of my family's last name is literally Uyghur. Okay? Like that's Cenk's last name. That's my mother's literal fucking last name before she married my father. So this is what is that sign? Hardly a serious fascist gesture, Lamau. I mean, it means different. The symbolism is important for Turkey. Obviously, it's laughable everywhere else. I even throw it up regularly.
Internationally, and the Grey Wolves would soon wreak havoc on left-wing activists. Naturally, whenever fascist paramilitaries are created, the eyes of the Yankee CIA defenders of democracy and freedom shine with excitement.
Then Jim Angleton appeared in August. He began recruiting fascists because he figured that the best way to control the communists was to hire fascists.
CIA officer Ray Klein said in an interview on Operation Gladio in Italy, quote, "It was not far-fetched that some far-right groups were recruited because, after all, they would be the only ones to warn us if there was a risk of a war against the communists in Italy." Former CIA agent Philip Agee, who wrote books revealing sensitive information, stated that, quote, "Paramilitary groups, directed by CIA officers, operated in the 60s throughout Europe, and perhaps no activity of the CIA could be as clearly linked to the possibility of internal subversion." Mehtap Söyler explains in her book how Western powers used Operation Gladio to promote Turanism in Turkey through Alparslan Türkeş as a founding member of the counter-guerrilla. In 1965, a new intelligence agency was formed with the help of the CIA, the National Intelligence Organization, or short MIT, not to be confused with this MIT. The MIT soon penetrated, quote,
To add some nuance, there was a serfdom in Turkey. The progressive left-leaning people were co-opted by the ultra-nationalist-led coup because the coup was against the feudal lords and Islamist Menderes. That makes the story in Turkey much more complex, yes.
The entire fabric.
And Turks still hold, Turks, as a consequence of ultra-nationalist sentiment, still hold a massive, massive amount of, pre-AKP, the way that the army was seen is like the protectorate of Turkish democracy. And still to this day, many Turks see it as such. And will criticize that genuinely eviscerating the influence of the Turkish military in general. However, obviously the Turkish military does, military shit all the time. But it does add a layer of complexity to the conversation for sure.
Of the Turkish society. Many MIT members and Grey Wolves, which one could barely distinguish at that point, would join the Gladio counter-guerrilla.
MIT is the Turkish CIA.
Counter-guerrilla were institutionally united and from 1967 operated out of the secret CIA-sponsored Special Warfare Department in Ankara. The central goal of the department being, quote, in the case of a communist occupation or of a rebellion, to use guerrilla methods and all possible underground activities to bring an end to the occupation. The CIA was so successful in creating a massive web of Turkish secret services, even MIT officers would acknowledge they were dependent on Washington. In 2008, a court document during the so-called Ergenekon trials revealed that the MIT had funded and armed members of the Grey Wolves in order to carry out political assassinations, such as against Kurdish or Armenian liberation fighters. Toward the end of the 60s, MIT members would also cooperate with the Israeli Mossad to murder Palestinians. In Turkey, another economic recession worsened the situation dramatically. At the end of the decade, social unrest intensified, labor strikes, student riots, political assassinations, and so on. Turkey had adopted 5-year plans in the 60s, not the socialist ones, but state-directed capitalist ones, to develop industry through import substitution. This led to rapid growth of the working class, going from 2.2 million wage earners to almost 4 million by 1970, including 600,000 women who previously worked in agriculture or at home. Due to the more liberal constitution of 1961, worker organizing was made easier, hence trade union membership tripled to 1 million throughout the 60s. The increased labor organizing caused headaches among industry leaders.
Yeah, even though the origination, or not the origination, but like the labor unions were supposed to be co-opted, obviously in times of economic volatility, instability, labor unions still were like, okay, well, we're going to do what we're supposed to do, and became more revolutionary as a consequence of the economic uncertainty. And therefore, this created yet another problem for the labor unions, or for another problem in the eyes of the Turkish government against the labor unions.
In February of 1969, during the so-called Bloody Sunday, tens of thousands of left-wing students and workers marched on Taksim Square in Istanbul to protest against the arrival of the US 6th Fleet. Among the key leaders of that protest was a certain Deniz Gezmiş. More on him later.
Chad.
The Association for the Fight Against Communism had called for a counter-demonstration. During the rally, right-wing extremist groups, with the protection of law enforcement and with some of them controlled by the Turkish counter-guerrilla, attacked the protesting people with knives, chains, and sticks. 2 protesters were killed.
This is Bloody Sunday. That's crazy. Why would the police... What? How could this have happened?
And over 100 were injured, all under the eyes of the police, who merely attacked the left, but not their buddies from the right. The working class did not forget those who fell on Bloody Sunday. A year later, the state-affiliated Turkish Trade Union Confederation had requested an amendment to the trade union law, which would have effectively led to the closure of the more left-wing Disk Union. After the amendment went into effect, unions called for protests on June 13. 20,000 people were expected, but when 150,000 workers took to the streets of Istanbul, even the trade union leadership was shocked. The most brutal police repression, all the tanks and gunshots, couldn't stop the protesters. Only a state of emergency, which...
Turkey is still significantly more radical in comparison to America, by the way. Like May Day, in my lifetime, even when I was growing up, May Day was like... May Day still to this day, I think. Maybe not to this day, but like when I was growing up, May Day was a massive, massive fucking site of protests. Still, May 1st, internationally, that is the real Labor Day, which is ironic considering that it comes from the United States of America, and yet we don't have it here. We have a different Labor Day in the United States of America than May Day.
Was declared 3 days later, could bring this historic protest.
They suppressed May Day in Istanbul heavily this year. They didn't let people travel to Taksim. Yeah, nowadays you can't. Nowadays they don't even let you do it, I guess.
To an end. It was this massive worker struggle in June of 1970, which is now
Class consciousness yok ama nedense TR'de işçiler May Day'i çok seviyor, haklarını biliyorlar.
Considered among the largest of organized labor in Turkey's history, which Kaypakaya considered to be, quote, proof that the objective conditions of the revolution have become mature in Turkey. The ruling classes concurred and interpreted the two-day workers' uprising as the beginning of a systemic crisis of Turkish capitalism. Something big needed to be done quickly to save the system from the wrath of the people. The social unrest would lead into another major coup in 1971.
Yeah, May Day is a celebration for what happened in Chicago. How dumb is that the USA doesn't celebrate it? Is it dumb? Or is it deliberate?
Ushering in one of the bloodiest decades of recent Turkish history, where thousands would die at the hands of CIA-assisted right-wing terror. At the beginning of 1971, Turkish society was in mayhem. Turkey's second coup was only a matter of time. Labor strikes exploded everywhere, universities stopped working, and young left-wing activists